You need to learn React. It is the most popular UI framework, and for a very good reason. It simplifies building complex user interfaces. But I get it, React is a huge departure from traditional web development, and getting started can be daunting. But that's why I'm here. Hi, I'm Jeremy McPeak. I can teach you everything you need to get started with React. We'll start at the very beginning, and I will show you how to create a new project, and you'll learn about the key files that every project needs. From there, we'll start building a to-do application. You'll learn about components and how React is a component-driven development framework. I'll teach you how to pass data to components and how different components can interact with one another. You'll learn about the difference between and how to write stateful and stateless components. You'll also learn the different ways to handle user input. We have a lot of ground to cover, so when you're ready, we will get started. Before we dive into React, we should first go over the tools that you will need not just to follow along in this course, but to develop applications with React. And the first thing that you need is a code editor. Now, technically, you can get away with just any text editor because that's all code is. However, code editors have a lot of features that make it a whole lot easier to work with code. And when it comes to working with JavaScript, there is no better code editor than Visual Studio Code. That sounds like an opinion, but it's not. It's fact. There is no debate about it. And while I'm not going to say that you need to use Visual Studio Code, I recommend it. And it doesn't matter what platform you're on, Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, you can download and install Visual Studio Code. Now, there are many code editors available, and many of those are free. So while I do recommend Visual Studio Code, I also recommend that you download and install and try as many code editors that you can find. And when you find one that you really like, stick with it. There's really no wrong answer here. So after you have a code editor, the next thing you need is Node.js. Now, we aren't going to be writing applications for Node, but there is a tool that you get when you install Node.js. It's called Node Package Manager, or NPM. It's what we use to manage the things that our applications are going to need. In our case, we are going to use NPM to create our project. And there are some other tools built in that we will use as well. So the version number really doesn't matter as far as our purposes are concerned. However, you typically do want the LTS version. That stands for long-term support. You can go for the current version, but that's more like the beta version. When there are new features added, it's added to the current until those features are matured and hardened, and then those end up into the LTS. Now, the installation is very straightforward. Just download and install it, take the defaults, and you will be good to go. Now, there's something else that I recommend that you use, and that is the React developer tools. These are tools that run inside of the browser, and you will see me use them in this course. Now, since most browsers are based upon Chromium, you can head to the Chrome Web Store and install it on whatever Chromium browser that you're using. I'm using Microsoft Edge in this case, but there's also the React developer tools for Firefox. It's not a necessity, but it is a very nice thing to have. It's free, so you might as well just download and use it. Now, when everything is installed, you will want to go to the command line because NPM is a command line tool, and we will be using NPM. However, in this case, we're going to use a command called npx. This is for executing code, and what we want to execute is something called create React app. And as its name implies, this is for creating a project that has React. It has everything that we need to get started. And then we just follow that up with whatever name that we want. So let's call this React to do. And whenever you press the enter key, it's saying that it needs to install the following package, which is the create React app. And our only option is yes. If we don't choose yes, it's not going to create our project. So of course we want to install this. So we will choose yes. And then it is going to go through the process of downloading and installing the Create React app, which is then going to create our project. And when it's all said and done, we are given a list of commands that we will use to develop our application as well as build it so that we can then deploy it. But the first thing we need to do is cd into that new directory. And then we want to run npm start. That's going to start our application in development mode. Now, it may automatically open up your default browser, but if not, go ahead and open up whatever browser you want, go to localhost port 3000, and this is what you should see. And in the next lesson, we will look at the project structure and start developing an application. Let's take a look at the project that we created in the previous lesson. We're going to start with the source folder and then the index.js file. And probably the first thing you will notice are lines 8 through 10. We have some markup. This is XML. Yes, we have XML inside of our JavaScript. It's an old technology called JavaScript and XML. It's been around for a very long time. However, there was never native support for it inside of the browser, so nobody ever used it. However, with frameworks like React and Vue and many others, it is now very popular. So the question then is, if there's not native support for JSX, how are our applications working inside of the browser? Because, well, we have proof right here that it is working. Well, there are tools behind the scenes that are taking our code, optimizing them, and compiling them into JavaScript that the browser can understand. One of those is called Webpack. The other is called Babel. Babel is really the compiler. It's taking our code and transforming it into something that the browser understands. Webpack does a lot of other things, and we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty as to how all of those things work. But I want to point out a few things here. So yes, we are using XML inside of our code, and you can see that we have this react.strict mode. That is one element. It has a child called app. Now, this app element is actually being imported here on line 4. Import app from, and then we have the file. That is actually the app.js file. So if we open that up, we're going to see a lot more XML. And while this looks like normal HTML elements, these are XML. So one thing to remember as we are developing our applications, all of the markup has to follow XML rules. So that means all elements have to have an opening tag and a closing tag, unless if they are a self-closing tag, like this image element. There's also some other rules that we will talk about, like for example, you can see class name is being used here instead of the class attribute that we would normally use in HTML. We'll talk about all of that later on, and you'll understand why that is the case. But I also want to point out two things. The first two lines here, we are importing an SVG file, and we are also importing a CSS file. So one thing to start to wrap your head around is that our applications are essentially built with JavaScript. We aren't really working with HTML or HTML files. So if we need to add CSS to our application, we typically do that by importing the CSS into the file that we need to import that. So if you'll notice on the left-hand side, we have an app.css, an app.js, and then an app.test.js. These three files are all part of what we call the app component. We will talk about components later, but you can see here that this is just normal CSS. There's nothing special about this file, but it is being used by this app.js. It is simply importing that. So this is adding a reference to that CSS file. Everything gets linked together and compiled, and then we see the result here. So let's take a look at the source of this page. You're going to see a very clean HTML file. But one thing you aren't going to see is the HTML that we actually see here. We don't see the HTML for the logo, for the text, or anything else. That is because all of that is being built in JavaScript. So Babel and Webpack are working together to create this bundle.js. This is the only JavaScript file that this project has. And this bundle.js is the result of taking all of the code from our project and generating this bundle. So all of the JavaScript, all of the HTML, all of the CSS are being dynamically added to the page. So then the question becomes, where does this HTML come from? Well, that is inside of another folder called public. So let's take a look there, because there's a few things, but really the only important thing is this index.html. This is our template, and it is very close to the resulting HTML that we see in the browser. In fact, if we did a line-by-line comparison, you're going to see that the majority of the lines match. There are some differences, such as you'll see this public URL, and that looks like a variable, and that is exactly what it is. So this index.html is our site's template. So you might be tempted to put some assets here, and some assets are perfectly fine here if they are global assets like fonts, or if you wanted to include something from a CDN, this might be the place to do that. However, as you are developing your application and you are writing your own CSS, you will typically want to put that inside of the source folder so that you can then reference and import those into the application. So there's two very important things to take away from this lesson. We need index.js. This is the entry point of our application. If we don't have index.js, so if it's renamed or if it's deleted, the application isn't going to work because this is the entry point. We also need this index.html. This is the template that our project is going to use. So once again, if we rename this or if we delete it, our application won't work because there is no template. So we need those two files in order for our application to work. We can include XML. We can't put it anywhere, but over this course, you're going to learn how we can use XML inside of our JavaScript files. So in the next lesson, we are going to delete most everything that was generated by Create React App and start developing our application. React is a library for building user interfaces, and we build a user interface with small, isolated pieces of code called components. Now, the idea of building a user interface with components is not new. It is relatively new in terms of web development, but using components to create user interfaces have been used for decades for desktop development. So in this lesson, we are going to delete everything inside of the source folder, and we're going to start from scratch. And one of those things is going to be a component. But first, remember from the previous lesson that we need a file called index.js. This is the entry point of our application. And the very first thing we need to do is import React. In fact, just get in the habit of writing that as your first line of code whenever you create a JavaScript file inside of a React project, because just about every JavaScript file that we create is going to be for a React component. The second line of code that you should get in the habit of writing is importing React DOM. Now, in the early versions of React and React DOM were a single library. However, they were later separated out, which makes a whole lot of sense because they serve two different purposes. React is, well, it's the React library itself. React DOM is for working with and manipulating the DOM. It also gives us access to components that look like HTML. Like, for example, let's create a paragraph. Well, how do we do that? Well, just with a P element, just like this. And then we can have the text of Hello React. So let's stop right here. Remember that in the previous lesson, I said that we aren't really using JavaScript. We're using JavaScript in XML or JSX. So XML is a native part of the JavaScript that we are writing. And so in a normal JavaScript file, one that would run inside of the browser, this of course would be wrong, very, very wrong. But it's not the case here. XML is just part of the technology. We can use XML in JavaScript. That is what JavaScript and XML is. So even though it looks very wrong that we have just assigned an XML element to a JavaScript variable, this is actually completely and totally valid. So literally, we have XML assigned to a JavaScript variable. However, logically, what we have is really a React component, because behind the scenes, this P element is not HTML. This is a React component that is to emulate a P element, at least as far as our code is concerned. Whenever it is rendered in the browser, it is rendered as a P element in HTML. So let's go ahead and let's render this. And we do that using React DOM, because remember I said that React DOM is for working with and manipulating the DOM. So we want to render a React component, and we have one in our paragraph variable. And so then we need to specify where we want to render this. Well, if we look inside of our template, we have a div with an ID of root. That's where we want to render our application. So we just need to specify the element object of where we want to render this. And the easiest way to get that element object is to use getElementById. So there we go. We can save this file. We can hop on over to the browser, and that's not right. Let's refresh. And there we go. We have Hello React. Now, one thing that you would have just noticed, that the screen changed. It was a dark screen with the React logo. Then it suddenly changed to a white background and a huge React logo. Whenever we ran npm start a couple of lessons ago, this started our application, but it did so in development mode. So there is a file watcher behind the scenes. It's watching for changes that we make to our project, and it's going to rebuild our project every time it encounters a change. Then it will reload the browser. And well, just then it reloaded, but it didn't really reload it completely. So we had to manually refresh. So there are going to be times that we will make changes to our project, and then we can hop back to the browser and it's magically going to have our new content. There are other times that we might have to help it along and just manually refresh before we see that new content, but just keep that in mind. All right, so let's go back to our code. So we have this component that represents an HTML P element. We have our content. We are rendering that in the browser, but let's start to transform this into our own application. Now, if you'll remember from the project as it was created with Create React App, it created this app component, and that's what had the React logo and then the text and everything there. Whenever you look at other projects, you're going to see something similar, so that there is going to be one component that encapsulates everything else about the project. And it's really easy to just think of our project as an application in and of itself, because that's essentially what we have. We have an application that is for the UI portion of a larger application. And that's always how web development has been. We've had a client-side application, we've had a server-side application. But now with frameworks like React, that's a bit more apparent because we are building an application here. So you might see something like this, to where there is a file called app, and that is just the component that contains everything about our application. But in other times, it might be called the name of the application itself. So we have a to-do application, so we could call it to-do app or something like that. We're going to just follow the convention of calling it app. So we need to create this file, and it is simply going to be called app.js. The first two things we need to do is import React from React, and we also want to do the same thing for React DOM. Anytime that you want to render something, or if you want to use any of the built-in components that represent HTML elements, you need to import React DOM. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to create our own component that represents our application. And this is a JavaScript module. So we are just going to export a class. Let's call it app. But this needs to extend React apt component, because that is what is going to let React know that this is a component. Now, we can also create a component a different way by just defining a function. For right now, we're going to stick with a class, because a class has to have a method called render, because a component has to be rendered. And this is very much like the render method that we used inside of index.js, where we rendered the component that we wanted to render, which in this case was just a P component. Well, we can do the same thing inside of this app component. The render method has to return a React component. So with that done, we can go back to index. We can change this paragraph to what looks like XML. Well, it doesn't look like XML. It is XML, but we are importing that app component. Then we are using it as an XML element whenever we want to render that. And whenever we go back to the browser, let's have something that's going to be a little bit different here. Let's change this to Hello React 2. So if we go back to the browser, we can see that it automatically refreshed, and we can see that the content is what we expected to see. So in the next lesson, we are going to build out this app component, because we don't want to render just some random text like this. We want to actually start to render the UI that we are going to have for our to-do application. And we are going to build that UI with more components. In the previous lesson, we created our first component. It is the app component, and it is representing the application as a whole. So it is going to encapsulate everything. And so now we just need to build our application. And of course, we will do that one component at a time. But before we get too far, I do want to add in some CSS, something that is going to allow us to see something other than just the plain ordinary style sheet that comes with the browser. So I'm going to paste in Bootstrap's CDN. This will make it a little bit more pleasing on the eyes. And it also gives us a lot of classes that we can use to design our user interface. And of course, we will write our own CSS as well. So what I am envisioning right now is to have something at the top that gives us a quick and easy way of adding to-do items. And then beneath that, we will have a list of things, or the list of to-do items. So we can essentially break that up into two div elements. So we'll start with the first div element that is going to contain the to-do creation. And then, in fact, let's have some text here. This, of course, is going to be placeholder text. We will add in the UI later on. And then we will have the div element that is going to contain all of the to-do items. Now, one thing you will notice here in Visual Studio Code is that we have this red squiggly underneath this line. We need to pay attention to this because Visual Studio Code is very intelligent. It knows that we are working with React, and it knows that this is incorrect. And in fact, if we go to the browser, we are going to see an error. And it's very simple. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So remember a few lessons ago that I said we are working with XML. We have to follow XML rules. And any XML fragment has to have a root element. So what we need to do then is wrap this in another div element, which is easy enough to do. And then we start to end up with something that looks very horrible as far as the code is concerned, but at least that error goes away. So now let's start to format our code, something that is a lot easier to read. So if we put the different sections on their own lines and add some white space, that looks great. That looks like what we would expect to work with as far as markup is concerned. However, whenever we go to the browser, we can see that there's nothing there. And if we try to refresh the page, once again, there's nothing here at all. And the reason is very simple. JavaScript has a feature called semicolon insertion. So here on line 6, we have a return statement, and it is inserting a semicolon after that. What we need to do is have some kind of syntax that will tell JavaScript, hey, this isn't a complete statement. And so what you will see is something like this, to where we will have an open parentheses followed by our markup and then a closing parentheses at the end. And so now if we go back to the browser, of course, we see the content. There's not a lot of content, but we will get there. So the first thing I want to do is make this more center in the screen. And we can do that by using the container class from Bootstrap. So we can add that like you would think, or can you? You can. However, if you'll notice as I'm typing this, let's take that back out. I start to type class, and you can see that once again, Visual Studio is popping up with something that says class name. And that is because in React, whenever we want to apply CSS classes to our markup, we need to use class name. And the reason is very simple. Remember that this is not an HTML div element. We are not working with HTML. We are working with XML, but logically we are working with a component. A component is an object, and an object has properties and methods. So in this particular case, this div component object has a class name property, and that maps directly to the class attribute on the HTML element that will be rendered in the browser. So we use class name. Now, if we take a look back at the browser, I want some separation between the quick creation section and then all of the to-do items. So we can easily do that by adding some margin. So once again, we are going to use the class name property on our div component, and we are going to use a Bootstrap utility class. We're going to add some margin to the bottom, and we're going to use the max that is available to us, which is 5. I don't really know what that translates into as far as units are concerned, but you can see that we get a nice little separation between those two. We could also add some margin to the top, which would be MT dash, and this doesn't have to be too much. I just want something off of the top of the screen there. So that is going to work just fine. And so next, we need to design the area that is going to display the list of to-do items. So to me, it makes sense to have a div that is going to contain all of these other items. So we will have another div that will then contain the to-do item. But I want to do this. I want to have multiple pieces to these items so that we have the title of the item, if you will. And we might also want to have a short little description. Or we can leave the short description off so that we could navigate to another page so that we could see that to-do item in detail. I mean, that definitely is something that we can do at some other time. And then I would like some way to denote whether or not an item is completed. And we can easily do that by using a button. And we can use the success class to denote that this item is completed. And of course, we want some text to make it clear, yes, this is completed. And for items that are not completed, we could use a different class like danger or warning, or just anything other than success, as long as it would make sense to do so. So if we take a look at this, we're going to see that everything is lined up on the left-hand side, and I don't necessarily like that. I like the title and our little description there, but I want the button to be on the right-hand side. So we can accomplish this with Flexbox, but we're going to have to surround the title and the description with another div element so that it will look like this. And then for this div element that contains everything about this to-do item, which we can go ahead, let's give this a class of to-do item. That way, semantically, we can see that this is a to-do item. We can apply Flexbox to this element, and we can make sure that everything is justified as it needs to be. But I do want to add some padding here. And let's also add some margin to the bottom. But then importantly, we will have the Flexbox, and we will use justify content between. that's going to justify its children by putting an equal amount of white space between them. So what we will have on the left-hand side is, well, we could just save it, and that's what we have. We have the title and description on the left hand side. We have our button on the right hand side. I don't know if I like that large of a button, but then again, in terms of mobile, that might be great. The larger that you can provide a button for the user to tap, then that probably is going to be okay. Now, I do want to add a background color to our items. So what I want to do is create a new file that's going to have our CSS for this component. And there's nothing magic about the names of these files, because ultimately what happens is inside of our component, we come and we import the CSS. So we can technically name our CSS files anything that we want, but for the sake of maintaining our sanity, it makes sense to name our CSS and our components the same, so that we know that this CSS goes with this component and so on. So with that in place, we can add this to-do class here, and we will give it simply a background color of this. It's an off-white color so that we can kind of see it, but it does stand out from the white background. I do want to make this rounded, so let's add the rounded class. And that's going to look okay. It's not great, but I'm not a designer. So that whenever we would have another item, we would simply just need another one of these items, so that we would have item 2. Let's set the class down here to danger, and then the text can be not completed, so that then we would have our item 1 and our item 2, and that's something that we can work with. Now, we have essentially created two very similar things. We have the markup for one item, and then we have the markup for another item, which is very similar. There's just a few differences. And if we've learned anything from writing any little bit of code, we know that this is a perfect opportunity for code reuse, which means that this is a perfect opportunity to create a component. So in the next lesson, we are going to create a component that represents an individual to-do item. In this lesson, we are going to build a component for representing an individual to-do item. And of course, we want to display that item's title and description, and we also want to display the text as to whether or not the item is completed or not. However, also remember that eventually we want to display a different color button based upon whether or not the item is completed. Now, in some frameworks, we would have to create two separate components for both of those circumstances. But in React, we just need one component, and it will handle both circumstances just fine. So let's get started. Let's create a new file inside of the source directory. We'll call it todoitem.js. And let's copy the code from app.js. Let's paste it inside of to-do, because this is going to give us a starting point, because we of course need to import React and React DOM. Let's change the name of the class to todoitem, but then the render method just needs to return the markup for this particular component. So we can get rid of everything except one of our to-do items. So there we go. Now, before we do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and import this inside of app.js, because admittedly, that's what I always forget to do. I will create components, I'll get everything all set up, and then I will try to run it for testing, and I always forget to import that. So let's do that here. And then we can go ahead and use this to-do item inside of this app component. So we can go ahead and delete these two div elements, and then we can use our to-do item. Now, of course, whenever we view this in the browser, we are going to see the same content, because as far as our to-do item component is concerned, there's nothing dynamic about it. All of the data is hard-coded. And we, of course, want to change that. We want to pass data to each component so that it will display the data that we want. Now, I use that term pass, and that makes you think that we are passing data to a function. And later on, you will actually see that that is indeed what we do. Now, the terminology that we use in React is we are passing data through props. Props are really nothing more than properties, but we call them props. And you'll see why whenever we actually start writing the JavaScript that's going to handle that. But to pass props to a component, all we have to do is use an attribute on our element here. So we have a title. So we can set the title equal to item1 in this case. Then we can have a description prop, which we can have item1 description. And then we can have a completed prop, which we can set to true. And of course, we want different information for this other item. So let's just go ahead, copy and paste, and we'll change it so that it's item2 description. And then we can say that the item is not completed. So then we need to use this information inside of our component, and we do so with a property called props. And then from here, we just use whatever name that we need. So like we had a title prop, we have a description prop, and then we have the completed prop. So then the question becomes, how do we use that inside of our markup? Because if we do this, let's say that for our title, we'll try to say this props title. Well, whenever we view this in the browser, of course, we are just going to see the literal text of this props title, because at this point in time, React doesn't know that this is a JavaScript expression. So what we have to do is use syntax that tells React that we want to use a JavaScript expression, which is simply a set of curly braces. And then inside of the curly braces is treated as JavaScript. So we have something simple, just like displaying a title. So whenever we view this in the browser, we are going to see the values of item1 and item2. We can do the same thing for the description. So let's go ahead and do that. But we could say that the description is optional because, not every item is going to need a description. So remember that I said that this is a JavaScript expression. We can put any JavaScript expression here. So we can use a ternary expression so that if we don't have a description, then we could have like a default text, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this particular case. But if we do have a description, then of course we would want to display that description. So if we go back to our app components, and let's just leave off the description on this second item. So we'll just get rid of that. We'll go back to the browser. We will see that the first item has the item1 description and item2 has the default text. So anytime that we are inside of our XML and we want to use JavaScript, we use a set of curly braces, and then inside of that, we use whatever JavaScript expression that we want. So then we can do the same thing for completed here. So let's use a ternary. If the completed property is equal to true, then we want to display the text of completed. Otherwise, we want the text of not completed. So let's go to the browser. And what do we see? Not completed. Well, why is that? Because whenever we passed data to our to-do item, we definitely said that completed is true. And we are explicitly testing for true here. Because we can't just check to see if we have a value, because even false is a value. So what is going on here? Well, the data that we are passing to these props are strings because, well, hello, it's rather apparent here. We have a pair of double quotes and then a value inside of it. So it is treating these values as strings. So when it comes to the completed property, this is a string of true. This is a string of false. So then what do we do? Well, remember, if we want to use a JavaScript expression, we have to use a pair of curly braces. And then inside of that will be whatever value that we want for that prop. So here we are assigning the Boolean value of true to completed. Here we are doing the same thing, but it's false instead of true. So if we go back and look at the browser, we can see that, okay, we have completed and we have not completed. So in this particular case, we are essentially binding this JavaScript value of true to the completed prop. And in this case, we are binding the JavaScript value of false to this completed prop. Now, for the sake of readability, we would put each of these props on a separate line so that vertically it looks like that it's taking up a lot more room. However, it makes things a whole lot easier to read. So in the case of our to-do components, well, the results speak for themselves. We can definitely see the props that are being passed. We can easily see the values that are being passed to them. And that just makes our lives so much easier. So let's go back to our to-do item. And in the next lesson, we are going to look at how we can simplify the JavaScript expressions that we have inside of our markup. Because let's be real, while it's cool that we can have any JavaScript expression inside of our markup, it makes things a little bit less readable. And readability is key when it comes to maintaining software. In the previous lesson, we looked at two very important topics. First of all, we looked at passing data to components using props, and then using those props as JavaScript expressions inside of our markup. And those two things really allow us to provide dynamic content inside of our component. Like, for example, for our button text, we are choosing to display either completed or not completed based upon the value of the completed prop. And this is all done with a very simple JavaScript expression. However, I want to take this a step further. Not only do I want to provide dynamic content, but I also want to provide dynamic styling because we want to change the style of this button based upon the value of the completed prop. But we also want to do so in a clear and concise way because as it currently is written, yeah, we can read it, we can understand what's going on, but we can make this a lot more readable. And when you start dealing with markup, regardless of if it's React or Vue or any other one of these frameworks that allows us to use JSX, we want our markup to be as clean as possible because it is a declarative style of development. So one thing to remember is that this markup is in the return statement of a method. And of course, a method is nothing more than a function. And there's really nothing special about this function. It is just a normal JavaScript function. So before the return statement, we can have whatever code that we want. It can be JavaScript, it can be XML, it can be JavaScript and XML. So one thing that we can do just right off the bat that's going to make our markup a lot more readable is to destructure our props so that we have title, description, and completed variables. And that gives us something that's just a simple identifier that we can use inside of our markup. So this prop's title simply becomes this title. This prop's description just becomes description. And of course, this prop's completed becomes completed. But we can also take this a step further. We can take this entire JavaScript expression and we can replace that with a variable, which we can just call description text. And we can define that variable outside of our XML. We end up with the same result because it is the same JavaScript. However, it becomes very clear as to what we are doing inside of our markup. And we can essentially do the same thing for completed. So we'll have our completed text. So let's create that variable as well. But then we need to talk about our CSS classes because we want to use success for when the item is completed. We want to use danger when it is not. But the beautiful thing about this is that it all follows the same concept that we are talking about. So we can create a variable that is going to contain the appropriate CSS class. All we have to do is just write the code that's going to do it. So if it is completed, then the completed class is going to be success. Otherwise, it's going to be danger. And then we can change the class name property on our button to just a normal JavaScript expression. so that we'll have our button, and then we want to use the appropriate completed class. So it becomes like this. Now, you could make the argument that this is making our code a little bit less readable, and I could agree with that. So one thing we could do is break out these classes inside of its own variable and use that so that it would look something like this. We could have a button class variable where we build that string so that we can then use that directly inside of our class name. And so now whenever we go to the browser, well, we can see that change is automatically done. Our completed item is the green background, that is the success class. The incompleted item has the danger class, and everything else is working just as it did before. Well, in the next lesson, we are going to talk about handling events because we want to be able to click these buttons and change the value of the completed prop in those components. Setting up events in React is very straightforward. It's also going to look very wrong if you've been using the idea of decoupling your JavaScript from your markup because, well, I hate to break it to you, but in React, we couple our markup and our JavaScript. I mean, other than putting our expressions directly inside of our markup, it doesn't get any more coupled than this. And the same ideas and concepts are applied when it comes to events, because what we end up doing is something very reminiscent of the DOM level 0 event handlers. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, it is simply the event handlers that we used before there was a DOM standard. If we pretend that this button element is an actual HTML button, we would want to handle the click event by using the onClick attribute. And then, of course, the value would be some JavaScript that we wanted to execute. Same idea for React, except that onClick is camel cased. Because remember, we are dealing with a button component object. This is essentially a JavaScript object that has props. Those props, as you know, are essentially properties on that object. And since this is all boiling down to JavaScript, it is case sensitive. So there is a difference between class name with an uppercase N and then class name that is all lowercase. The same is true for onClick or any other event handler. So if we wanted to handle the mouse over event, we would use the onMouseOver prop there. So let's do something whenever we click on the button. Let's start with something simple, just like writing something to the console. So let's save that. Let's go to the browser. Let's open up the developer tools so that we can see the console. And right off the bat, you can see that that code has already executed and we haven't clicked any button at all. Well, it kind of makes sense because whenever the render method executes, of course, all of the JavaScript inside of that method is going to execute, including the code that is inside of our markup. And as far as onClick is concerned, we have just a simple JavaScript expression, writing something to the console. So this executes when the render method executes. So what we want to do then is essentially wrap this expression within a function, and we can do that very easily with an arrow function. So by making that very simple change, we can go back to the browser, let's clear out the console, and we can see that whenever we click on the buttons, that indeed works. So now we want to change the value of the completed prop so that we'll toggle its value. Essentially, if something is completed, then it will be not completed. If something is not completed, then it will be completed. So that might look like this, to where we set the completed prop equal to its opposite. And we already have the opposite value with completed. So let's try that. If we go back to the browser and click on any one of the buttons, we get an error. And it says that it cannot assign to read-only property completed. So here's something very important. Our props are read-only. They are immutable. And that is important. It's also very good because that means that the data that is passed to a component cannot be changed. We can ensure the integrity of the data that the component received. We can therefore always be sure that when the first item receives the value of true for its completed prop, that it is always true. So then the question becomes, how do we change anything? If we can't change data, what is the point of React and this whole thing? Well, remember that we are dealing with JavaScript objects. Objects can have as many properties as we need, and React gives us a special property called state. State allows us to track whatever data that we need to track within our component. So in our case, we essentially want to track whether or not the item is completed. So we need to first of all opt into using our state because we aren't using it by default. And we start by writing a constructor for this class. It is going to accept the props that were passed to the component. And we immediately need to pass those props off to the parent class, which is React component. That way React can properly initialize our component. But then after that, we just need to create our state. So we will define this state property, and then this is just an object. All we need to do is provide the data that we want to track. And in this case, it's going to be relatively simple. We just want to track this completed value, and we can initialize that with what came from the completed prop. So now inside of our render method, we no longer want to use the completed value from our props. We want to use the completed value from our state. So I am going to just create a new variable called completed that we will initialize with the value from our state. That seems to be the easiest way so that we don't have to change a lot of our code. And then whenever we click on our button, we want to change the value of our state. And we do that with a method called setState. Now, let me stop right quickly. When it comes to changing state, there are essentially two ways. You can mutate your state, which is taking your existing state and then just making some modifications to it. And that is typically what we've done in the past. However, years of experience have shown that that causes issues whenever you mutate state. It actually introduces a lot of complexity to everything. So instead, what we typically do now is just completely replace the state. That sounds like a lot of extra work, but it really is the best way to change state. Now, in our case, our state is very simple, just a single Boolean value. But to change our state, we're going to call the setState method, and then we pass in the object that is going to be our new state. So we are essentially going to reassign the state property, whatever object we pass to this setState method. So we're going to have the completed property, and then we need to specify its new value, which we basically just want to toggle it to its opposite. So now we can go back to the browser. Let's clear out the console and let's click on one of our buttons. And we can see that not only does the text change, but the color does as well. And we didn't write any of that code. And that's one of the beautiful things about React, is that now that we are using state and we are tracking the value of completed, our component changes because everything was based upon this completed variable. So now whenever we change state, React sees that the state of this component changed, so it is therefore going to execute the render method again. So we're going to write to the console, simply render, signifying that the render method was called. Now we're going to see 2 to begin with. Well, let's clear this out. Let's refresh. We will see 2 to begin with because the render method was called on both of our components. But whenever we click on one of the buttons, we are going to see render added to the console. And whenever we click it again, we're going to see that counter increase. So React, behind the scenes, recognizes that the state changed. It is therefore going to call the render method again in order to render that component and only that component. Notice that it's not re-rendering the first item whenever we click on the second item. And it doesn't re-render the second item whenever we click on the first item. Now, that is amazing. I mean, yes, in modern development, this is typical. But before we had anything like React, we had to write the code that made all of this work. And this is so much better. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to state, the question is always what components need state and which ones do not. And you can make the argument that this to-do item definitely needs state so that we can track the completed value, so that we can make all of this work. Does it really? Because in the grand scheme of things, in a real application, whenever we click on one of these buttons, we, of course, want this functionality to make an item completed or not completed, but we would also want to store that information in whatever data store that we are using. That could be local storage. It could be interfacing with a server API. I mean, there's a lot of different options. So when you start thinking in those terms, having state instead of our to-do item really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because then the question is, how does this to-do item interact with our data store? Well, it really doesn't. So instead, what we need to do is define our state inside of our app.js, because that is where we are using our to-do item components. So our app component would read the data from our data store, dynamically generate the to-do items, and then as these items change, the app component would then interact with our store and save those changes. So in the next lesson, we are going to start refactoring our application to use state inside of our app component instead of the to-do item. In the previous lesson, you learned about events and you learned about state. And we applied state to the to-do item component. We are tracking the completed value. And while that makes the user interface work, we also need to think in terms of the application as a whole. Because to me, it really doesn't make sense to track that value here inside of the to-do item component. It makes more sense for the app component to track the application's data. So in this lesson, we are going to lift the state out of the to-do item component and define it inside of the app component. So that essentially means we need to back out all of the changes from the previous lesson. Well, not all of them, but most of them, so that we have that completed variable that is being destructured from our props, and then everything else should work okay. We won't address the on-click event just yet, because we still need that. We still need to do something whenever we click on the button, but we will come to that here in a few moments. Let's go to the app component, and I'm going to paste in the constructor that we had inside of the to-do item, because since we are adding state here, we need to do so inside of the constructor. But of course, we want to track more than just the completed value. We want to track all of the data that this application is going to work with. So that means we need to track all of our to-do items, which is going to be an array of JavaScript objects. Now, for right now, we are just going to hard code this because, well, it makes sense to do so. Ideally, we would be loading the data from our data store, and we will get to that point eventually. But we need data to work with, so it kind of makes sense to hard code it now, and then we can add in our real data at some other point. So these JavaScript objects are going to have a title, they're going to have a description, and of course, the completed value. And we are going to have 3 of them instead of 2. And what we want to do is take this data and dynamically generate an array of components. We want an array of to-do item components specifically. And the way that we do that is very similar to what we did inside of the to-do component, where we dynamically generated the content that we wanted in the JavaScript, and we just simply assigned those to variables, and then we used the variables inside of our markup. That's essentially what we will do here, except that it's going to be just a tad bit more complicated because we need to transform an array of JavaScript objects into an array of React components. But really, it's still very simple because all we have to do is map those to-do items to the components. So the code is going to look a lot like what we did before, where we hard-coded in those to-do items. We can just copy and paste those. The only changes that we need to make are the actual values that we assign to the title, description, and completed props. Those values are going to come from the item. So after making those modifications, we can go to the browser and we can at least see if we have 3 to-do items to work with. So now we will get rid of these to-do items inside of our markup, and we will simply replace that with the items variable that we just created. So now in the browser, of course, it doesn't work. Let's take a look at the console so that we can see what error is there. Let's clear it and refresh just so that we don't have an entire page full of errors. So cannot access items before initialization, and that is being done right here on line 22. So this needs to be item instead of items. So let's go back. Hopefully we see the 3 items. We do. We have those 3 items. So we have successfully dynamically generated those to-do items. Now we just need to do something whenever we click on these buttons. So how do we do that? Well, of course, we have the click event on the button inside of the to-do item. And in the case of the button component, it has an on-click prop that we assign a function to. So we can essentially replicate that functionality. We can say that our to-do item is going to have an on-click prop. But I guess that could be confusing since we have a lot of on-clicks. So let's change this to on-toggle completed. So our to-do item is going to have a prop called onToggleCompleted, and we expect that to be a function that's going to do something. We don't know what it's going to do yet. But let's go back to the to-do item, and inside of the onClick event handler, we will call the onToggleCompleted prop. That's all we have to do here. So as far as the to-do item component is concerned, we are done for now. Inside of the app component, we just need to decide what we are going to do inside of this onToggleCompleted function. Well, we want to manipulate our state. And if you'll remember from the previous lesson, we have 2 options when it comes to manipulating state. We can mutate it, which is just changing a property here and there, or we can completely replace the state. And we talked about how replacing the state is actually better overall. So what we could do then is define a method here inside of the app component. We can just call it toggle completed. But we also need to know which item that we want to toggle. And we can easily do that with the index of the item. So let's get the index. We will pass the index to this toggle completed method. And all we have to do is define that toggle completed method. We will have the index. And then we just need to change our state. So the first thing we will do is get the to-do items. And we are going to essentially create a copy of our current state. And so we are not going to mutate the to-do items currently in our state. Instead, we are going to create a copy of that array. Then we are going to change the completed property on whatever item we need based upon the index. And we want to reverse that value. And then the final step will be to set our state. And we do so with set state, and we have the to-do items. So if I typed everything correctly, we should be able to go to the browser and we should be able to toggle these items. And we do. We can see that we now have the functionality that we did before, but our application is better off because now the app component is handling the data, and the to-do item components are now what are called controlled components. They are being controlled by the app component. And now that the to-do item component is a controlled component, we can now modify it into a function component, which is something that we will do in the next lesson. React lets you define components in two different ways. You can use a class, which of course is what we've been doing thus far. And using a class is very flexible. It lets you track state. You can define properties and methods that you can then use inside of the component. But a lot of times you don't need that extra functionality. And of course, there is an overhead involved by using a class because you are inheriting from a parent. There's a lot of setup that's involved behind the scenes. And sometimes you just don't need that because you don't need state or you don't need anything other than the output. And in which case you can define a component using a function. And since our to-do item component is now a controlled component, there's no state, there's nothing except outputting what it's going to look like, we can convert this into a function component. So to start, we want to export a function, and we, of course, need a parameter list. Now, a few lessons ago, I mentioned that, we are passing props to a component, and that kind of sounds like that we are passing data to a function. Well, here we go. Our function is called to-do-item. It is a component, and it is accepting the props as the argument to this function. Now, of course, we don't need render here because this function itself is the render. So with that simple change, all we need to do is take out the use of this and everything is going to work fine. So if we go back to the browser, let's just do a hard refresh. Make sure everything is loaded just as it should. We can see that the code is working just fine. But we can simplify this a little bit more because we are already destructuring our props. So why don't we just go ahead and do that for the props parameter? That gets rid of one line of code. And we can also include the on toggle completed in that destructure statement. So let's go ahead and do that. That way, we don't have to refer to props anywhere. We are destructuring it into a set of variables that we can then use inside of the function. And then we can also simplify this a little bit so that the complete class variable, we could just use this expression here whenever we create this button class variable. Makes it a little bit more difficult to read, but ultimately it is still very simple. So even with those changes, if we go back to the browser, let's once again just do a hard refresh just to make sure everything is okay. We can see that the functionality is still just fine. Now I'm going to open up the development tools because I have the React developer tools installed. We can go to the components tab and we are going to see that we still have those components. We have the app component, and whenever you click on one of these components over on the right hand side, you get to see information about that component. So you can see that the app has the state of to-do items. It has 3 items inside of that. If we wanted to delete any one of these, we would see the content in the browser change because we just changed our state. And of course, the application is reacting to that. But I wanted to show you this because even though we just changed our components from a class to a function, we still see them as components in the developer tools. And other than state, we still see the same information. We can see the props that were passed to them. And as we click on the buttons, we will see the values of the props change. Like, for example, this is item 3. If we click on this, we'll see that the completed changed to true because, of course, it does. We changed the state. So when you have a component that doesn't need state, all it needs to do is simply render the output, then write that component as a function. It simplifies your code. It also optimizes that component because there's no longer the overhead of using a class. Now that we have the overall UI finished for our list of to-do items and it is functional, we need to focus our attention on creating a new to-do item. And we have a placeholder for that inside of app.js. So let's start here. I'm going to import a component called create to do. Now, of course, this doesn't exist yet, but it will here in a moment. And this is what I typically do when I'm writing software. I start with the code that I want to write, and then I make the code conform to my wishes. And we want to use this component down here where we had that placeholder text. So we'll start there. and then we can create that new file. So we need to, first of all, import React and React DOM. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, anytime that you deal with a form, you are dealing with stateful data. And in order to interact with a form and its various form controls, we have to have state inside of our component. So that means we need a class for our component, and we will call it create to do. We, of course, want to extend React component. And let's go ahead and implement the constructor because we are going to need it, so we might as well do it. We need to call super. We'll pass in props. Let's go ahead and also initialize our state. We don't know what exactly we want here yet, but that gives us at least a starting point. And then as far as our render is concerned, I'm going to paste in some markup because you don't want to see me type all of this out. And it's relatively straightforward. It's just a form that has a bunch of bootstrappy stuff. So we have a label, we have a div element that contains an input element that's for the title for our to-do item. And then we also have another div element for the create button. And that's that. So whenever we save this, and there we go, that's our UI. It could look a lot better, but this is going to be just fine. Now, of course, the purpose of the create component is to, well, create an item. So we need to find some way to take the data from that component and supply it to the app component so that it can then manage our data. Well, that's not really too different than what we did with the buttons inside of our to-do items. Whenever we click on these, we are essentially signifying to the app component that, hey, this button was clicked. And the way that we do that is with the onToggleCompleted prop. That is a prop on our to-do item, and the app component supplied a function for that prop. So we can essentially do the same thing so that whenever an item is created, then the app component can provide the function that's going to handle that event. So let's just call this onCreateItem. And I'm going to write this a little bit differently than what we did for this onToggleCompleted, because this is more along the lines of what you would see if you were looking at somebody else's project. So that instead of creating an arrow function like we did here, you would simply just see the name of a method. So we're going to call this addItem. Let's define that method. I'm going to put this before ToggleCompleted because I like my things in alphabetical order. And this is going to accept the item that is going to be added to our state. And we essentially want to start off the same way that we did with the ToggleCompleted so that we get our to-do items. In fact, we get a copy of that because we're calling slice. But then all we need to do is push in that new item and then set the state, and we are good to go, at least as far as our app component is concerned. So we need to remember this prop so that inside of our create to do component, we handle that. And it makes sense to do that whenever we submit the form. So we have two choices. We can handle the submit event on the form, or we can handle the click event on the button. Since we've done the click event, let's handle the submit event. And once again, I'm going to use something that you would see in just about every project. So as opposed to using an arrow function like we've done before, and then we would call in a method name, I'm just going to supply a method, and we'll call this submit form. Let's define that method. And since this is an event handler, this is going to receive the event object that occurred. And this is very important because now we are getting into just normal everyday JavaScript development. We are handling the submit event on a form. The first thing we want to do is prevent the default action from occurring, and that is submitting the form. So we want to do that first, but then we want to call the onCreateItem prop. And then we would pass in the object that is going to have the title information, which right now we'll just have an empty string. We don't have anything for the description, but the completed will go ahead and set as false. The idea being that if we are adding an item, then it's something that we want to complete later. So we're going to just set that as false. So then really the only thing we need to tackle is handling the user input. So the first thing that we can do here is set the value attribute to what we have in the state. Now, of course, we don't have anything in the state right now, but let's just call this item title. And so inside of our state, we'll have that item title property. It'll be an empty string. So this is important because we want to essentially tie this input element's value to our state. And this is the first thing that we can do is set the value of that input element to what we have in our state. But then we run into a problem because now we have hard coded that value essentially, and we can't change it because the value is always going to be what is set inside of the state. So what we need to do then is handle the change event so that whenever the user types something into that form field, we change our state. And once again, I'm going to use this new pattern of just specifying the function or the method that we want to handle this event. I will call this change title. So let's go ahead. Let's define that change title. Once again, since this is handling an event, it is going to accept the event object. And we want to set the state so that the item title is set to whatever was entered into that form field. So we need to get the value of the event target. So now what we have essentially done is tied this input element's value or its state to the state of this React component. And in the previous lesson, we talked about controlled components. Well, now we have essentially changed this input component into a controlled component because it is controlled by this create to do component. So now let's change this inside of our submit form where we just specified an empty string for the title. Now that we know what is inside of our state, it's that item title property. So that's going to be our title and everything should be good to go. Or should it? Let's go to the browser. Let's pull up the developer tools because we are going to see a lot of errors. Well, actually, we just see one error. Let's refresh the page and well, I thought we'd see more here, but let's enter something. And you can see right off the bat that we get an error that it cannot read properties of undefined. It's trying to read the set state property that is inside of the create to do on line 14. So let's take a look here, right here inside of the change title. Now, this makes perfect sense because once again, this is just normal everyday JavaScript stuff. Whenever we set up an event handler, like we did for the onChange event for this input element, the function that we used to handle that event executes within the context of the element. It does not execute within the context of where we defined that function. I mean, this is normal. If we had used add event listener. So let's just assume we knew what the input element object was going to be. We have the add event listener. We say change for the event, and then we specify the change title function. We would see the same exact behavior there. One thing that we did to get around that was to bind that function object to this. And that's exactly what you see if you look at other people's projects. Inside of the constructor, there would be some statements. So that change title is going to be reassigned the value of change title, but it's going to be bound to this. Therefore, we can use the change title to handle any event and it would execute within the context of this component object. We essentially want to do the same thing for submit form. So let's make that change. Now, this is going to fix at least the change event. So we can go back to the browser. Let's just do a refresh. Let's make sure. And then let's change the value. You can see that the error goes away. But the minute that we create this, we run into another error because we need to do the same thing inside of the app component. So let's go over there. It was this add item method. So we will simply follow the same pattern, to where we essentially create a new function object for the add item method that is bound to this component. So with that change, we should be able to go back and add a new item. We don't get an error, and we can see that the item was added to our list of to-do items. And if we look at the components using the React developer tools, we see 4 to-do items. If we add in a 5th item, then we will see another component added. We can see the props there. We can see that it is not completed, but if we click on that button, then we can see that it is completed. And of course, if we look at the state for the app component, our to-do items, we have 5 of them. If we remove, let's say, the first one, of course, that is going to be removed. And now we just have items 2 through 5. Now, this is one way of handling user input. We call this using controlled components because, once again, this input component is a controlled component. It is controlled by our create to do component. The issue with this approach is that it can be tedious because we need to not only set up the value, but we also have to set up the on change event. So if we had other form fields, then we would have to do the same thing for each individual field, and that could be a little tedious. So in the next lesson, we are going to start developing the edit form so that we can edit our to-do items. So we will look at another way of handling user input. Before we can implement the edit feature, we need to implement the UI for our edit form. And we're going to do so using Bootstrap's modal dialog. So what I want to do is modify our current UI. We're going to put this on a grid so that a grid is 12 columns wide. The to-do items that we currently have are going to be 11 columns wide. And then in that 12th column is going to be a button. Whenever we click on that button, it's going to pull up the modal so that we can edit that particular item. So every item is going to have an edit button and its own modal. So since we are going to be using Bootstrap's modal, we need to bring in its JavaScript library. Thankfully, it does not rely upon jQuery anymore, so all we have to do is pull that in via a CDN, and we are good to go as far as that is concerned. And let's start within app.js, because this is where we generate our to-do items. We're going to change this so that we, first of all, have a div with an ID, well, not an ID. It's going to have a class of row. And we're also going to use the align items center class so that everything is going to be centered vertically. And then we'll also add some padding. And the first column is actually going to be 11 columns wide. So we will use the call 11 class. And this is where our to-do item is going to go. So let's go ahead and let's put that inside of there. And then the final column is going to be where we will put our edit component. And this is just going to have a class of call that's going to fill in the rest of that row. And even though this is going to contain a button, it's also going to contain a modal. So let's just use the name edit modal for this particular component. Of course, it doesn't exist, but here in a moment, we will create that. Let's go ahead and import that so that I don't forget to do that later. And then we can create that new file. Now let's go ahead and let's copy the first few lines from app.js because we're going to need some of the imports. This is going to be a class because there's going to be state, even though this is going to be slightly different from what we implemented in the previous lesson. If you'll remember, we used a controlled component. The input element that we used was controlled. Well, what we are going to do for our edit modal is use uncontrolled components. But even still, we need state. So we are going to use a class for this component. Let's change the name to edit modal, and then let's get rid of all of the import statements that we don't need. All right, so as far as the render method is concerned, I'm going to paste in pretty much all of the markup because when you start working with modals and Bootstrap, yeah, there's a lot there. So I'm going to paste this in. the first thing you will probably see is that we're using this React fragment. This is just a fragment. It's a lot like a document fragment in the DOM. The idea being that instead of using a div element to wrap everything in, because we essentially have two elements here. We have the button that's going to serve as the edit button. Then we have the modal. We could wrap all of that within a div, but that's kind of changing things structurally. The React fragment doesn't, and it serves as the root element of our component here. So whenever you are inside of a component and you need to wrap something without using a div, this React fragment will work pretty well for you. Now, very briefly going over the markup, we have the button, which I've gone ahead and set up the onClick to call the show modal method, which we will implement here in a minute. And then as far as the modal is concerned, there's a lot of elements involved with the modal. Basically, there's a header, there's the body, which is going to contain our form, and then there's a footer, and the footer only has a save changes button. So if we wanted to cancel out of anything, we would just need to close the modal by using the X in the upper right-hand corner. All right, so let's talk about how we are going to show the modal, because we can't really rely upon the typical mechanisms that we would use with just normal JavaScript, because everything hinges really upon an ID value. And since we are creating multiple edit modal components, we can't really use an ID. For example, let's open up the to-do item and let's add an ID to each one of these. We'll just call this item ID. And let's go to the browser. Let's inspect any one of these. And whenever we look at the div elements that serve as our items, you'll see that they all have an ID equal to item ID. So there's one. Let's inspect this other one. Once again, we will see that it has item ID. Right there, we can see that it's replicated. So ID is kind of meaningless when you start dealing with components because, well, you can have multiple components with the same ID. So we can't rely upon that. Instead, what we are going to have to do is use a ref or a reference. So let's define this show modal method. And in normal JavaScript, we would get the element that represented the modal. That would usually be done with get element by ID. Then we would create a new bootstrap modal, passing in that element object. And then from that variable, we would call the show method. So the idea is going to be the same, except that we are going to use what are called refs. So what we want to do is set a reference for this div element that serves as our modal dialog. And we create a ref very simply. First of all, this is part of the class. So we're going to create a new property just called modal ref. And we're going to call react.createRef. This is going to create a reference that we can then use inside of our markup. So for our div element, it has a ref prop, and we're going to set that to the modal ref that we just created. So that whenever we want to reference this particular div element in this particular component, we would use this ref object. And the way that we do that is like this. We use that modal ref property, and then it has a property called current. That gets us the DOM element object for this div element inside of this particular component. Now, we're going to run into an issue because if we try to run this as is, we'll have an error that says that it can't find Bootstrap. And that makes a lot of sense because we've imported React, we've imported DOM, but we haven't imported Bootstrap. But Bootstrap is globally available to our application. So what we can do then is just say that this is window.bootstrap, and that's going to fix that particular problem. We do need to bind the show modal method to this particular object. So let's go ahead and do that like we did in the previous lesson. And that should get this working so that whenever we go back to the browser, the alignment's off, but we can fix that. Whenever we click on this edit button, it should display a modal. And it does. Now, of course, we want to make sure that this modal is for this particular item that we have. So let's pass a prop to our edit modal. For right now, we'll just pass the title. And we will do so exactly like we did with the to-do item. And then inside of our render method, let's just make this easy for now. In the next lesson, we will clean it up. But for the title here of the modal, we're going to add this props title so that we can see the title for the modal. And whenever we click, we can see that that is item 1. We can now see that this is item 2, and this is item 3. So we have our UI set up and ready to go. In the next lesson, we are going to implement the functionality for editing our items. Let's finish implementing the edit feature so that in the next lesson, we can look at saving and loading data. And we're going to start inside of app.js, where we have our edit modal. We are supplying the title. We need to do the same thing for the description. We don't need to send the completed because we have a whole UI dedicated to toggling that value. But we do need another prop, something that's going to be similar to the onToggle completed, but only when an item has been saved, or rather I should say when it has been edited. So let's call this onItemEdited. And this is going to be a function that is going to accept the edited item. And then we want to call our own method inside of this component. We'll call it save item, to where we will pass in the index because we need to know what item that we are currently working with. And since we have the index as we are mapping over our to-do items, it only makes sense to supply that. And then we will pass in the edited item. So while we're here, let's just go ahead and implement that because it should be relatively straightforward. So of course, the first argument is the index. Let's go ahead and let's destructure this edited item so that we have the title and we have the description. And that makes it very easy to work with those values. And we're going to start the same way as the other methods, where we are going to create a copy of our to-do items. But then we are going to modify the to-do item at the given index. We want to set its title equal to the title of the edited item. We'll do the same thing for the description. And then finally, we will set the state, and that will save everything as far as the edited item is concerned. So as far as this is concerned, we are done. We can move on to the edit modal because this is really where the majority of our work is going to be. So let's first of all destructure the values that we need. Now we are already using title here, and we should only need the description as well. So let's go ahead, destructure our props just to make it a little bit easier to work with those values. And then we need to talk about how we are going to access our form fields. Now, a couple of lessons ago, whenever we used a controlled component, we had to create our state so that we could tie our state to the particular form field. But then we also had to handle the onChange event. And that was a lot of work. Since we have multiple form fields here, I don't want to do that. And especially if we had a form with a lot of form fields, taking the route of using controlled components would be very tedious. So here we are essentially going to replicate what we did in the previous lesson by using refs, because we can set up a ref for our input element, which is for our title, and then the text area element, which is for our description. And by using those refs, we can directly access those elements and we can get their values so that whenever we are done editing an item, we can get those values very easily. We don't have to write a lot of onChange event handlers. So let's create those ref objects. We'll call the first one title ref. We'll call the second one description ref. And then of course we need to set those up. So let's go to the input element first. This is for our title. So we will use the ref prop, and that is going to be our title ref. Let's copy and paste that for our text area, which is for our description ref. Now, that's not it, however, because we do need to provide the data that we want to edit. Because if we look at this right now, our form is just going to be empty because we haven't told it that this is actually the title data. This is actually the description. Now, we can't use the value prop like we did with the controlled component, because once again, this is going to tie the value to our prop and we won't be able to edit that. Now, I didn't demonstrate that the last time, but since we're here, we might as well. So it's great that in the title, we can see item 1, but I can't change anything. So what we can do then is set a default value for these form fields, which is just another prop that we can use, default value. That's going to set the default value so that then we can edit it. And then when it comes time to actually save it, we will use the refs. So let's copy this default value for the text area. That is for our description. And now we will be able to edit those form fields. That's great. Now we just need to handle the save changes whenever we click on that button. So we need to set up the onClick event, and let's just call this handle edit so that we can define that method. Now, since this is handling an actual event, let's go ahead and let's bind that to this object. And then this is where we are going to use our item edited. I think that's what we called it. Let's take a look at that prop, and it is on item edited. So this is where we will use that on item edited, and then we will pass in an object that has a title property. We will get its value by using our title ref. We want the current object or the current element node, and then its value. And then we want the same thing for the description. And so we will make the necessary modifications. So that's going to tell the app component, hey, this item has been edited. This is the new data. But we also need to close the modal. Now, whenever we show the modal, we are newing up the modal constructor, and then we are showing it. We can't do the same thing to hide it. Instead, what we need to do is get the current instance since it is already shown. So we will once again create a variable called modal, but we will use a static method on the modal class. It's simply called get instance. We'll pass in our modal ref. We want that current object. And then that is going to give us the modal that is currently being displayed. And then we will simply hide it. So there we go. That should make all of this work. So if we go to the browser, let's open up the edit modal. Let's change this from item 1 to first item. And then for the description, we'll just say that this has been edited. So whenever we click on the save changes, we should see everything change, and it has. That is awesome. If we click on edit once again, it's going to load in all of the new data, and we are good to go as far as that is concerned. Now, we could simplify this a little bit because we are referencing the same modal, just slightly differently. And I think it would be cool to have a getter simply called modal, so that we'll first of all try to get the instance of that modal. And if there isn't one being displayed, then that's going to return null. So that then we can assume that, okay, we need to create that object so that we can show the modal. And that will make our code just a little bit cleaner inside of our handle edit and show modal, so that then we can just say this.modal and this.modal. We can get rid of these variables, and then let's try that. So let's hop on over to the browser. Let's do a hard refresh just to reload everything. We'll try to edit this item. We'll call this first item, and we'll keep the description, but we'll just add some text there. We'll save it. That looks great. We'll open it up again. I don't like that edit. We'll get rid of that. We'll save. And that looks good to go. So in the next lesson, we will focus on loading and saving our data. We write applications to work with data. And where that data is stored really shouldn't impact our application because our application should work regardless of where our data is. The idea being that if we decide to change where we store our data, we should make minimal changes to the application, not a whole lot of changes. Like, for example, I think it makes a lot of sense that our app component would be completely dumb as to where it gets the data and how it saves the data, to the point that we would have props so that our to-do items that we work with in our state would actually come from the props. We would have simply to-do items that would come from our data store, and then our application would load that into state, and then there we go. We have the data to work with. And the same thing for saving data. I think that we could have a prop called on save items, to where the app component would provide the to-do items from our state, and then our data store would handle saving that. So that's the approach that I am going to take. And I'm going to start inside of the index.js file because this is where we are essentially going to provide that information. We're going to have the to-do items prop, and we are also going to have an on save items, which is going to be really nothing more than a callback function. So that whatever function we provide here, I'm just going to call it item storage. This function is going to be responsible for saving the items. That way the app component doesn't know anything. It's just going to call this on save items prop, pass in the items, and then the item storage is going to handle that. So let's say that our item storage is going to have a method called get items. And so now we just need to implement that. So this is going to be inside of a different file. We'll call that file simply item-storage. And let's create this. I'm going to use local storage because that's what we have access to. And this will be relatively straightforward. So we're going to export a default object here. That's going to have two methods. We'll have one called get items, so that the first thing that we will do is attempt to get the to-do items from our local storage. We'll just call the key to-do items. Now, of course, we might not have any items there, so we need to check, first of all. If we do have items, then we need to parse this because you can only store strings in local storage. So we're going to save it as JSON, and we're going to parse it out whenever we read the data from it. Now, if we don't have any items, then we are going to turn simply an empty array because, well, we need some place to start, and an empty array is going to be just fine. So that is getting our items, our save items. We will receive the items that we want to save, and then we will just use the set item method on local storage. Our key is, once again, to-do items. And then we want to call stringify. Why they couldn't call it serialize, I don't know. But there we go. That is our little library of interacting with our data store. So all we really need to do is fix this syntax error in index.js. That is fine. So now we just need to look at app.js. Now, as far as the to-do items are concerned, we are already set up to load those from our props. But every time we set state, we essentially want to save our items. So it kind of makes sense to have a method called save items to where we are going to receive the to-do items. And then here we will not only set the state, but then we will call the on save items prop, and then we will pass in the to-do items. That way our state and then the data that we have in local storage should be kept in sync. This does mean that we will need to use the save items method instead of set state in the other methods. We also need to change the data that we are passing. We just want to pass in the array of items, not an object that has a property of to-do items. And that should work. So let's save that. Let's go to the browser. Let's open up the developer tools, although we aren't seeing anything here. So let's go to the console. Everything looks okay. We don't have any errors. Local storage get items is not a function. That is a problem. So it helps if you use the correct API for local storage, but that should fix that. And we have an empty UI now. This is what we would expect to see because we are loading data now from our local storage, which there's nothing. So let's add in an item, add creation functionality, and then we will create. And voila, we have an item. Although invalid DOM property class, I must have missed a class attribute somewhere. It's probably in the modal. We can fix that. That's not a big deal. But let's go to the application tab because that is where our local storage is. And we can see that we have a JSON structure. It's an array that has an object where the title is add creation functionality and completed as false. If we complete this, we can see that it changed to true. So we saved our data. Let's add another item. And I should have changed the text. We should have added the functionality to clear that whenever we create an item, but that's easy enough to do. But let's change this so that we save data to local storage. And then for the description, use local storage for data store. Let's save this. That did get saved to our local storage as well, but let's not complete this. Let's do a hard refresh. This is going to simulate reloading the application. We can see that it is pulling that information from local storage. We see it here. That's completed. Let's refresh and voila. So we have a working application now. Let's very quickly fix that little bug so that whenever we create a new item, it will clear out the text box that is inside of the create to do. And really all we should do is inside of the submit form, after we call on create item, we should be able to set our state. And we will just set the item title to an empty string and that should work. So let's test that. We want the title to be fix the title bug on creation. Whenever we click create, that should clear out the text box. It does. And everything looks good. So that is complete. So when working with data, design your application to be data source agnostic. It should work the same regardless of where the data comes from. React changed the way that we build web applications, and it's my hope that as I leave you, that you have the fundamental understanding of how to build applications using React. Now, of course, we just scratched the surface of what React has to offer, and in the near future, we will look at other topics such as Redux and routing to add more features to our to-do application. Now, I recommend checking out the tutorials and documentation at reactjs.org. It is, after all, the place for React info. And of course, you can also head over to Tuts Plus, where we have a lot of courses and tutorials just waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching this course. From all of us here at Tuts Plus, thank you, and I will see you next time.